Hey everyone, continuing our conversation. This is Michael Clark, the host of the CCA's Leadership Development Podcast. My guest on today's podcast is Dave Dillon, Senior Vice President and Principal at Lewis Ellis. We spent the last segment talking about what we've called now volunteering and disappointment, which definitely go take a listen if you are jumping into this one first. But for this last segment, Dave, we want to talk about leadership for a few minutes. That is part of the point of this podcast, is to help people learn from other people's experience with leadership. So in thinking about people that you consider to be successful leaders, what traits do they have? How do they demonstrate their leadership? What do you see?
So I think, when we talk about leadership, one of the things I kind of learned early on, and I try to think about it as I'm a quote unquote leader now is, and this sounds so simple, but we're all just people and they may not know anything. They don't necessarily have any more answers than you. I
Mhm.
think a lot of times we maybe focus on somebody and we might put them in too high a regard, and that could lead you into you leading, trying to lead the way they lead, but that may not be the best for you. Okay. So I think that the way I always, maybe another way of saying it is, not every leader is going to fit your style. You need to take, I always try to take a nugget, one nugget from this person, one nugget from another person, one other nugget. And you've got to realize that you are a compilation of all these little traits that other people are doing. And so that's how I've always kind of viewed it. Is I think, and then maybe some of the more important ones again, and I mentioned this in one of the prior segments, was that listening. I think a lot of people think of a leader as that go-getter, maybe front of the battlefield, flying the flag, military type, let's go get them. But I think the best leaders are the one that might admit, you know what? I haven't been in this situation before. You, as my staff, some of you maybe have. Listen, ask the other opinions. I think those kind of traits have really jumped out at me as I have interacted with other actuarial leaders.
No, all of that is spot on. I completely agree with you. So when you think about some of your role models when it comes to leadership, how have you tried to emulate their examples?
Yeah, so kind of what I was just saying is, I don't know if I have, like, if you said, Dave, who is your one, person that you look up to? And not to downgrade all the influences that, all the people have had on my life, is it really is just a mix of things, right? So it is you do have to take those nuggets, and then you kind of play around with them, right? You try to figure out if that works for you, and you emulate that one that kind of that one aspect that you've seen from somebody, and then you kind of build your own. And then I think along with that, what I have also learned is, um, there's never an end game, right? You've never become the perfect leader. I learned a few years ago, so that maybe early in my career, I mentioned an earlier segment, we were a small company. I only worked for a handful of people, and I was obviously strongly influenced by this small amount of people, right?
Mhm.
And their management style worked for me. And so when I was young, I was like, man, this management style is great. Worked for me. I'm going to use it on my staff. And I did it for several years. And I look back, kind of looked in the mirror and go, you know what? I'm a horrible manager. I was doing stuff I felt like I was a great actuary. And one of the examples was, I would like give somebody an assignment and go, you've got the freedom to do whatever you want. I'm not going to just overlord you and tell you how to do something. Well, there's a flip side to that. A lot of people were like, they didn't know where to start.
Mhm. Mhm.
They felt like I wasn't giving them guidance. I was letting them blow in the wind. That's the flip side of that. So I'd like to think, about that 5 years ago or so, when I kind of had that aha moment, is I realized it's not a leadership is not one size fits all. You you do need to kind of modify how you lead based on the different organizations or groups or people you are with. And it's a continuing evolving process. You know, what I may have done 10 years ago may have worked a little then, but it may not work as much now. And so that's a lot of what I've learned is just watching people evolve and just realizing that you do have to keep evolving.
Yeah, no, I love that actually, and it made me reflect on some of the people that I've had in my professional career that, especially from a manager standpoint, right? There's one that I can think of early on in my career when I was an analyst, the first company that I worked at, and I had several managers throughout that time, but there's one in particular that I always went back to his style to say, you know what, that's what I want to be like. If I'm ever in the position of managing people, I want to be like this guy was for me, and being able to pull out those different traits from people along the way to say, hey, how can I apply this to these situations? And then figure out, how do you make that work for you? Because obviously you can't be that person, and then you've got to adapt it to the circumstances. And you, like you mentioned, when you're dealing with maybe even a younger generation, they may need something different than how you would envisioned how you were going to lead and manage, and all of that stuff has to, it is a work in progress for
It
sure.
definitely is. And I would say, and I will definitely not mention this person's name, but there was someone at my company that I did not enjoy working for too much. Okay. But I will say you do learn from that, right? You learn what not to do the next time, right? So
Hmm.
you have to learn from those negative situations. But I will also say there were some things that that individual did with, like, he may not have been the best one-on-one manager, but
Hmm.
he had some elements that were very good in the client situation, right? So I think a lot of times you see these negative situations and you think of them just as negatives, 100% negatives, but you do have to, again, pull out those nuggets of positivity. So this individual may not have been the best manager of people. He was pretty good with managing clients, and I learned from him in terms of that side of stuff.
Like there's probably another lesson embedded there too about playing to people's strengths. As far as you mentioned, this particular person, they had a strength in managing client relationships,
Definitely,
and
definitely.
that doesn't necessarily mean that they should be managing people, right? And that gets talked about a lot, I feel like, in the actuarial profession, as people are evolving in their careers, and just because somebody is got more tenure or moving up in the corporate ranks doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best people manager or
Absolutely.
the best salesperson even, right?
Correct.
It's about learning people's strengths and playing to those as a team, which I again, I think from a leadership standpoint, that's something that we can all take into account when we're building those teams and trying to figure out how are we going to be successful as a group.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So, Dave, with what you've observed throughout your career, and where we are now as a profession, what do you see as the imperatives for people that want to be successful leaders within the actuarial profession going forward?
So I think it's a couple things. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is to be open to other opinions and other ideas. I I think a lot of times actuaries, I hate to use this phrase, but tend to think they're the smartest people in the room,
And sometimes
right?
we are.
And we may be, but I think that when you have been so highly educated and trained and, credential, that rigorous process we go through to become actuaries, I think we always think we have the right answer a lot of times. And I think we have to step back and say, you know what? There are other opinions that are as valid. It may not be exactly the way we do it, or as I would prefer to do it, but I think we have to be open to the other ideas. And I think that has helped me the last few years. We talked about an earlier segment when I was on the board of directors, just listening to those other ideas. And I've definitely taken pieces of wisdom from, their approach, those people's approaches, you know, and I think that goes into the other main thing, and a lot of actuaries talk about this now, and I do agree with it. Is it's the communication skills. I think as actuaries, even if you work for an insurer and maybe, you don't have as much interaction with as many people as maybe a consultant, but if you can't communicate with your boss or your principals, or, if you're presenting to leadership within your company, you've got to be able to communicate. And I do think that the society and other organizations are working on trying to, work on, like adaptability, emotional, adaptability and things like that. Because again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is if you can't adapt to disappointment, you're not going to go very far, I don't think, in your career, right? If you give up every time something goes wrong, well, you're not going up that corporate ladder. And so I think you've got to be able to adapt and communicate with different people. And, in my role as a consultant, I do interact. I mentioned briefly earlier, I never thought I would have to kind of play the politics game a little bit. Well, I don't think my traditional actuarial training helped me be able to present to a state legislature, or talk to health policy people about, what policies to implement or not implement, and how to convince them they are wrong. Right. I think that's a lot of times. I remember I had a discussion with some Republican congressmen, and they were presenting some ideas, and you have to be able to communicate. So even if I know I'm right, I joke that, we always know the right answer. And in that case, I didn't think we had the right answer, but I had to convince them of that. Right. And so even if you have the right answer, doesn't mean other people are going to go with your idea if you can't, in a nice way, convince them, or, talk through the issues so they are okay with that.
Which is a skill set in and of itself. Well,
Yes.
and Dave, like you mentioned, that's part of what we're aiming to do here with this podcast through the CCA and our leadership development community, is help actuaries learn some of those skills. We know actuaries have the technical chops, but as you mentioned, there are much more. There are many other skills out there to be learned and mastered that you're not necessarily going to have to study for an exam.
That's exactly right. That's
So
exactly right.
I want to thank my guest on our podcast today, Dave. This has been a great discussion. I mean, talking through your career, writing and speaking, volunteering and disappointment, and your views on leadership. This has just been a great conversation, and I know our listeners will greatly benefit from your perspective. So I appreciate you joining
Yeah,
me
I
today.
really appreciate you having me on. It was a fun discussion, and I really appreciate it.
And for Dave, those that want to connect with you, I'm assuming the best way to do that would be through LinkedIn. I know you're
Yeah,
pretty active
LinkedIn, I'm
there.
pretty active. If you're not connected with me, please connect. It is Dave Dillon Actuary is the member name on LinkedIn. Look forward to hearing from you.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Dave, and thanks to all our listeners. And we look forward to the next time.